Today I want to talk to you about white gold. You may want to write some notes down or get this tape. White gold. I was reading and I was searching and looking, and I found the title of a book that was called Men of Salt. Everybody say Men of Salt. It was written by Michael Beninoff. And the title caught my eye, but the subtitle explained a lot. Here's the subtitle: Crossing the Sahara on the Caravan of White Gold. How many of you know that the Sahara is a treacherous desert there in the Middle East, between Egypt, there in the Holy Land? Crossing the Sahara on a caravan of white gold. The reason it's called white gold, salt is called white gold, because at one time, literally, salt was worth its weight in gold. And so these caravans, these nomads would go and they would trek the uncharted desert. And they would mine the salt and they would cut out big blocks and they would bring it back to populous areas. There was no maps. It was called, and I think this is important, the land of terror. Even terror, even the fear of those marauders and the men that would lay in wait to come and to rob them of their salt, that did not keep them from going and packing across that desert with their camels to get that white salt. You know why it was that way? Because you cannot live without salt. Said, I cannot live without salt. You can't live without God either. Said, I can't live without God. I began to look at this thing and I found that in the ancient Hebrew and Arabic, it gives us some insight into how important salt was in ancient cultures. The words war and peace. Everybody say war and peace. Where do you think those words come from? They come from the word for salt and bread. War and peace in ancient languages come from the word for salt and bread. I read that some even believe the first squabble or war of any consequence was over salt supplies. Salt was such a necessary part of daily life, it became more than just being worth its salt or white gold. It became a sacred symbol. It became a sacred symbol to several things. Salt became a sacred symbol to good life. It represented incorruptibility. It represented fidelity. It represented morality. It represented integrity. It represented purity. It represented hospitality. It represented loyalty. No one can live without salt. No one can live without God. In 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 12 through 22, there's the story of Elisha and Elijah. And the story goes that God speaks to Elijah and he chooses a young man, Elisha. And now it's time for Elijah to go home. And Elisha is told by Elijah, if you see me go, then you can have whatever you want. He wanted a double portion. Everybody said double portion. And so he went to a certain place, and the two went on. He went to another place, and the two went on. And he went to another place, and the two went on. They get to Jericho. Come to the Jordan there at the Jericho, and all of a sudden the Lord catches, Elijah out. And there's a whirlwind and a chariot of fire that comes and picks up Elijah and takes him away. He didn't need a spacesuit. He's taken away. And we begin to look at this story. All of a sudden, Elijah's mantle comes floating back down to the earth. And he picks up the mantle and he strikes the Jordan. and he goes across. And that's a miracle in itself. He's practicing with his new anointing. And he gets there in Jericho, and all of a sudden, the people of Jericho said, you know, our waters are no good. They're for naught. And so he says, go get me a cruse of salt. They bring a cruse of salt to him. He takes the cruse of salt. He walks over to the well, and he throws the salt down in the well, and God healed the well forever. It represented God's covenant. When we begin to look at this, we begin to understand something. I saw that the first mention of salt, that's always important, is in the Salt Sea in Genesis 14:3. Genesis 19:26, the second mention. It's Lot's wife who would not live in obedience, and she turned into a monument, a pillar of salt, a monument to disobedience. In Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13, with every sacrifice, there has to be salt. In Numbers 18:19, once again, you see the covenant of salt. And David's house would be blessed, and there would always be a legacy. There would always be David's line that would rule. It was a covenant forever. Everybody say forever. Do you have morality in your life? Are you moral? Do you have integrity in your life? That's salt. Do you have integrity? And then, of course, you have to understand, do you have salt in yourself? Do you have loyalty? To thine own self be true. The corruption around us, folks, is crying out to us. Do you hear what I just said? The corruption around us is crying out to us. We have become churches and a society without salt. Now, there's a connection between corruption and failed covenant. Because salt is a preservative, it speaks of enduring covenant. And the covenant of salt with God was a statute forever. Everybody say forever. Do you understand what I'm saying? It was a statute forever. So when David hears God say, I've entered into a covenant of salt with you and with your generations, from God's side, his salt was pure. It had the character and the nature of God in it.